I'm Maren Voss, 49, and I went from handling lines on my father's harbor tug to wearing an Admiral star in the United States Navy. For 27 years, I gave the service everything I had. My 30s, my marriage, every Christmas but 4. But when a shore patrol petty officer dragged me off a pier by the collar in front of 2 ships' crews, 2 days before I took command of that very waterfront, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been manhandled, dismissed, or written off by someone who decided who you were without ever asking? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit that like button and subscribe. The first thing I ever learned about the Navy, I learned from a rusted cleat on a wooden pier when I was 9 years old. My father ran a harbor tug out of a working port on the East Coast, the kind of place where the coffee was burned by 6 in the morning and every man on the waterfront knew every other man's business. He would walk me down the pier before the sun came up, before his crew arrived, and he would read the boats the way other fathers read the newspaper. A sagging line here, a streak of rust bleeding from a scupper there. Fenders hung crooked or hung right. He never needed to step aboard a single one of them. He told me once, with his hand on that rusted cleat, that a boat will lie to you all day long once her crew is awake. Paint covers a lot, smiles cover more. But at dawn, before anyone knows they are being looked at, a boat tells the truth. So does a pier. So does everything else, he said, if you learn to come around early enough. My father could read a ship's whole soul from the pier. He never once needed to step aboard. I carried that lesson into a life he never quite pictured for me. In 1995, I left for university on a Navy ROTC scholarship, the first person in my family to go, and I spent my summers back on the tug, handling lines and pumping bilges while my classmates did internships in air conditioning. In 1999, I was commissioned an ensign in the United States Navy, 22 years old, with a surface warfare contract and a duffel bag my father had carried in his own merchant days. He drove 4 hours to watch me raise my right hand. He shook my hand afterward like I was another captain, and I understood that was the highest thing he knew how to give me. The early years were the grind that every surface officer knows. My first destroyer taught me how little I knew, and taught it to me at 2 a.m, over and over, in the passageways and on the bridge wing and in the Combat Information Center, where the coffee tasted like the inside of a paint locker. In 2001, I stood my board and earned my surface warfare pin, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that my father would have inspected the ship differently than the Admiral who pinned me. The Admiral looked at our ribbons. My father would have looked at our lines. The Navy took things from me in those years, the way it takes things from everyone who stays. I married a good man in 2002, and by 2007 the marriage had starved to death so quietly that neither of us could name the day it stopped breathing. Deployments, duty days, a geographic separation we kept calling temporary. He was kind about it. I was fair about it. It ended anyway. I do not tell that part of my story for sympathy. I tell it because everything that came later was paid for, and I know exactly what the price was. In 2005, as a lieutenant, I was assigned as flag lieutenant to Vice Admiral Elias Crane. I was 28 years old and terrified of him, which he found tedious. Crane was a tall, quiet man who had commanded everything the surface Navy would let him command, and he had a habit that his staff treated as an eccentricity, and I came to understand was the whole man. In every port we visited on the first morning, before his official calls, he would put on civilian clothes and walk the waterfront, alone. No aide, no protocol officer, no phone call ahead. Just an unremarkable man in a windbreaker, walking piers at dawn. The first time he took me with him, in a foreign port I will not name, I asked him what we were looking for. He stopped, looked at the bow watch of a ship whose captain would be pouring him wine that evening, and said the sentence that reorganized my whole career. A base wears 2 faces, Lieutenant, one for the brass, one for nobody. Only the second one is true. Then he bought me coffee from a cart and pointed out, without a trace of anger, every single thing the waterfront had just told him. The watch that did not look up, the safety line with 3 feet of slack in it, the chief who walked past both and saw neither. That evening at the reception, I watched him say nothing about any of it to the captains in their whites. He did not need to embarrass anyone. He needed to know. What a man does with what he knows, he told me later, is the entire difference between authority and vanity. I gave the Navy the next 2 decades the way my father gave the harbor his knees and his hearing. Department head tours, a promotion to lieutenant commander in 2009, the executive officer grind starting in 2015, and then, in 2017, at 40 years old, command of a destroyer. I walked her pier at dawn before I ever met her crew. Old habit by then. Older loyalty. Crane retired around the time I screened for command, and in 2019 he sent me a letter, actual paper, in handwriting that was starting to wander. Most of it was congratulations and gossip about men we had both outlasted. But one line I have carried in my wallet ever since, through a squadron command as a captain and every watch since. "You will know the standard is real," he wrote, "the day it works on a stranger." He died in 2024. I spoke at his funeral in my dress blues and folded that letter back into my pocket afterward, and I remember standing at the edge of the reception, thinking that I had buried the man who built me before the Navy ever pinned a star on me. Some debts you repay to people who will never see it. You repay them anyway. That is rather the point. By then I had given the service 27 years, a marriage, most of my 30s, and every Christmas but 4. I am not tallying grievances. I signed up for all of it, twice over. I am telling you what was in the account because in the spring of 2026 the Navy decided to pay it back with a star, and with a waterfront that was about to teach me, one more time, why my father and Elias Crane walked piers at dawn. The message came in January of 2026. I had been selected for Rear Admiral, lower half, 1 star after 27 years of service. The selection was early, and I will not pretend otherwise. Early enough that a few contemporaries stopped returning my calls, and early enough that I reread the message 3 times looking for my own name in it, as if it might belong to some other Voss. With the star came orders, command of the surface group at Naval Station Calder Bay. Anyone who has spent time in the surface Navy knows a base like Calder Bay, even if they have never been there. It was a big, proud, salt-crusted station with a waterfront that had been winning awards and cutting corners for a generation, and the 2 facts were not unrelated. Calder Bay had a reputation, and the reputation had swagger in it. Their sailors walked like the pier belonged to them personally. Their chiefs told the best stories at every school I ever attended. Their statistics were immaculate. My predecessor sent me a turnover binder in February that weighed as much as a toolbox. It was beautiful, tabbed, color-coded, full of green check marks and upward trending charts. Readiness up, mishaps down, inspection scores that looked like an honor student's transcript. I read it cover to cover in one evening and felt the specific unease my father used to feel looking at fresh paint on an old hull. I had a new flag aide by then, Lieutenant Freya Odom, 29 years old, sharp in the way that has nothing to prove, and everything filed. 3 days after the binder arrived, she came into my temporary office with a folder of message traffic and mishap reports she had pulled on her own initiative, and she laid it next to the binder without a word of editorial. Then she allowed herself 1 sentence. "Ma'am, the binder says 1 base. The message traffic says another." She was right, and it did not take a genius to see it, only someone willing to look. There was a mooring line near miss from the previous autumn, the kind of event that should have generated a month of soul-searching, closed out in 9 days, with a finding of no fault and a recommendation of no changes. There was a small fuel spill with a report so carefully written that no human being's name appeared anywhere in the narrative, as if the hose had uncoiled itself. There was a pattern of injuries on the piers, wrists and shoulders, and 1 broken ankle, each one minor, each one explained, none of them ever added together. Paper can be polished. My father taught me that before I was tall enough to see over a bollard. Calder Bay's paper shone like a parade boot, and underneath it something was off in the step. The other thing that reached me before I ever set foot on the station was smaller, and at the time I nearly forgot it. In February, at a conference, an officer who had just left Calder Bay told a story at dinner, the way people tell stories about a base they have survived, with affection and an edge. The story was about the waterfront shore patrol, and specifically about a first-class petty officer, unnamed, who ran the piers, in the man's exact words, like a bouncer who owned the club. There was a whole folklore about him, apparently. The time he lifted a contractor off the ground by his badge lanyard. The time he made a lieutenant junior grade cry. The young sailors imitated his walk. Everyone at the table laughed, and I laughed too. And then I spent the drive back to my hotel, wondering who had taught him that this was what right looked like, and who had watched it happen and said nothing. Promotion cycle after promotion cycle. Every base has one sailor the young ones copy. Nobody ever asks who taught him. I want to be honest about what I knew and when. I did not know his name. I did not know I would ever meet him. I knew only that a waterfront with perfect paper and a folklore of manhandling people did not add up. And that arithmetic like that is never wrong by accident. So I decided to do what Elias Crane would have done, and what my father did every working morning of his life. My change of command was scheduled for a Thursday in March. I arranged to arrive in town 2 days early, quietly, no honors, no staff car at the airport. On the Tuesday morning, before the sun came up, I would put on civilian clothes and walk the waterfront at Calder Bay as an unremarkable woman in a windbreaker. Not to trap anyone, not to gather ammunition, to see the base's second face, the true one, before the first face was arranged for me on a parade field with a band. I told exactly one person, Lieutenant Odom, because an aide who discovers her admiral has vanished tends to escalate. She listened, nodded, and being the kind of officer she is, made one procedural argument. An unidentified adult walking a restricted waterfront at dawn was, in her words, a scenario with failure modes. As a compromise, she sent Harbor Operations a one-line courtesy note that a flag officer would be conducting an unaccompanied walk of the waterfront that morning. Identity and exact timing not specified, no escort required, no notifications desired. I thought it was overcautious. I signed off on it because she was doing her job well, and I have spent my whole career trying to reward that instead of arguing with it. I have thought many times since about how much of what followed balanced on that one small act of thoroughness. Not because it saved me, because of who was on watch to receive it. The night before, in my hotel room, I laid the windbreaker out on the bed next to the garment bag that held my dress blues for Thursday. Navy blue, plain, a little frayed at the left cuff, older than some of the sailors I was about to command. My ID went in the inside pocket, where it always goes. I stood there a moment looking at the two of them side by side, the windbreaker and the uniform, the nobody and the Admiral, and I remember thinking that by Friday I would know which one Calder Bay respected, and that whichever answer I got would tell me everything about the next 2 years of my life. I set the alarm for 04:30 hours and slept like a person who already suspects what the morning is going to cost. Fog sat on the water that Tuesday morning, the way it sits on every harbor I have ever loved, low and moving, so that the ships at Pier 4 came out of it in pieces. 2 destroyers, nested rails, shore power cables running like veins. I came through the pedestrian gate at 05:30 hours with my ID checked correctly by a bored civilian guard at the perimeter, which I noted with approval, and I started down the waterfront with a paper cup of gas station coffee and 27 years of looking. A base only shows its true face to someone it thinks is nobody. That morning, I was nobody, and Calder Bay talked to me the whole length of the pier. The brow watch on the first destroyer was sitting down, feet up on a bit, and did not look at me at all. The safety lines along a stretch of the pier edge had enough slack in them to swing a hammock, and one section was married to a stanchion with what I can only describe as a hopeful knot. There was a chafing plate rusted through to lace. There was a fire station with a cracked hose gauge and an inspection tag from the previous spring. None of it was catastrophic. All of it was truth, the specific kind of truth that never appears in a binder with color-coded tabs, and I was reading it the way my father taught me, slowly, without touching anything, when I heard boots on concrete behind me and a voice pitched to carry across both brows. "Hey, you don't belong here, lady." He was a big man, and he walked the way the story at that dinner had described. Like the pier was his, and the morning was his, and I was a problem the day had delivered for his entertainment. First-class petty officer, shore patrol brassard on his arm, cover squared, jaw working. I learned his name later, Deacon Pruitt. Boatswain's mates, first class, 32 years old, 12 of them at Calder Bay, which turned out to matter. I turned around slowly, kept my hands visible, kept my voice level. "Good morning, petty officer," I said. I have business on this waterfront, and I am happy to identify myself. I am going to reach into my inside pocket for my ID. I want to be exact about what happened next because I have told this story many times since, and I have never needed to decorate it. He closed the distance between us in 3 strides, and when my hand moved toward my jacket, he slapped it aside, not a defensive block. A slap, dismissive, the way you would knock a fly off a sandwich. Then he took hold of the collar of my windbreaker with a fist like a mooring shackle, twisted the fabric tight, and began to walk. And because he was 6 inches taller and 80 pounds heavier, I walked too, half dragged, half stumbling, back down the length of Pier 4 the way I had come. "You people kill me," he was saying, loud enough for the brows, warming to the performance. "Cones, signs, a whole fence line, and you civilians still wander in here like it's a farmer's market. Rules don't apply to you, right? Somebody important, right?" He gave the collar a shake on the word important, and my coffee went over both of our shoes, and somewhere off to my left I heard a young sailor laugh. I want to tell you what I was thinking, because people always assume it was rage, and it was not. I was thinking that both duty sections were watching, phones half raised, and that not one person in a uniform I had worn for 27 years had said a word. I was thinking that this man's hands were entirely confident, practiced, easy, and that you do not get hands like that on your first try. And I was thinking, with a clarity that hurt more than the collar did, that everything I had read in Odom's folder was standing on this pier wearing a brassard. 27 years, and the collar of a windbreaker was what the Navy held me by. I did not fight him. I did not announce myself. Announcing yourself in that moment is what vanity does. I let Calder Bay finish its sentence. What I did not know, and Pruitt did not know either, was that up in the Harbor Operations Center, a lieutenant commander named Adele Marsh had the waterfront cameras up, the way she started every watch. She had read Odom's courtesy note the evening before. She had also read the change of command announcement 2 weeks earlier, the one with my official photograph on the second page. She told me afterward that she watched the woman in the windbreaker walk the pier for 6 minutes, thinking the face was familiar, and that when the Shore Patrol petty officer took hold of that woman's collar, the familiarity resolved itself all at once, like a lens snapping into focus. Adele Marsh did not call a supervisor. She did not send a runner. She keyed the base-wide net, the one that lives in every radio on every belt on that entire waterfront, and her voice came out of all of them at once, calm and cold, and absolutely without hurry. "Shore Patrol, stand down. Release the Admiral. Now." I felt his hands open before I heard the radio finish. He let go of my collar the way you let go of a panhandle you have just discovered is hot. And he stepped back, and the pier went so quiet I could hear the shore power transformers humming and the fog dripping off the rails. Then the waterfront did the thing I will remember for the rest of my life. The brow watch on the first destroyer came off his bit and to his feet. Then the second brow. Then, piece by piece, sailor by sailor, both duty sections came to attention in the fog. No order given, like dominoes falling in reverse, until the only people moving on Pier 4 were the gulls. Captain Gideon Halloran, the naval station's commanding officer, arrived at a dead run about 90 seconds later, tie crooked, apologies already leaving him in ropes. I let him finish one of them. Then I straightened my collar, picked up my dropped coffee cup, and set it on a bollard and looked at the big man standing rigid in front of me with his career visibly draining out of his face. "Petty officer," I said quietly, because quiet was the only register that morning deserved. "Walk with me." And he did. Down the rest of Pier 4 and back, past the slack safety lines, past the rusted chafing plate, past the fire station with the expired tag. I pointed at each one and said nothing else. He looked at every single thing I pointed at. To his credit, and it took me weeks to grant him that credit, he never once tried to explain. When we reached the pier head, the sun was starting to burn the fog off, and I left him standing there, staring at the water, a big man getting smaller in my rear view as the base woke up around him to a morning none of us were going to be able to take back. By noon, the story had crossed the base twice and improved considerably in the telling. By dinner, I am told, there were versions in which I had thrown Pruitt into the harbor, versions in which he was already in the brig, and one ambitious version in which the Secretary of the Navy had personally called Calder Bay. What actually happened that first evening was smaller and, I think, more important. Captain Halloran came to see me at my hotel because I did not yet have an office. And he brought with him the particular energy of a commanding officer who believes his own career now has a countdown clock on it. He was not wrong to worry. The base was his. The waterfront culture was 12 years in the making, and he had owned the last 3 of them. He offered me speed. That is the currency people reach for in those moments. Pruitt could be at captain's mast by Friday, he said. The whole thing could be handled, documented, and closed out before my change of command, so that my tour would not begin under a cloud. He used the word discreet. He used the word contained. He never used the word buried, but it sat in the room with us like a third chair. I told him no, and I want to explain the no because it was the most important decision I made at Calder Bay, and I made it before I ever took command. If Pruitt went to mast in 72 hours, in a closed room, with the paperwork moving at a speed no seaman deuce ever saw paperwork move, then the lesson Calder Bay would learn was not that you must never put your hands on a person on this waterfront. The lesson would be that you must never put your hands on an admiral. Rank would have protected itself, briskly and efficiently, the way it always does, and every sailor on that pier would have understood the real rule perfectly. The rules are for protecting the important. If it only gets fixed because it happened to an admiral, it never got fixed at all. So I asked Halloran for the opposite of speed. Run the investigation by the book, I said. In daylight. Same process, same timeline, same rights, and same scrutiny, this base would give the case if the person dragged down that pier had been a contractor's welder or somebody's grandmother. And since it was me he dragged, I will be recusing myself from the disposition entirely, and saying so in public. Halloran blinked at that. Then something in his shoulders came down an inch, and I caught the first glimpse of the officer he might have been 3 years earlier, before the binder got so beautiful. The next dawn I went back to the pier head, in uniform this time, with 2 coffees, and Lieutenant Odom met me there. We stood where Pruitt had let go of my collar, and we watched the fog move. And she was quiet for a long time before she said the thing that reframed the whole event for me. "He put his hands on a stranger, ma'am," she said. "That is the part that should scare us. He thought that was the job. He thought that was the job. Not one sailor on 2 brows had thought it looked wrong. The laughing kid by the bollards had thought it looked funny. Somewhere over 12 years, on that beautiful award-winning waterfront, the job description had quietly rewritten itself, and an entire generation of Calder Bay sailors had learned the new version by watching, the same way they learned to walk like him. I thought about Elias Crane that morning, the way I always do when the water is gray. In 2005, after that first walk in the foreign port, I had asked him, with a lieutenant's bloodthirstiness, which of the people we had seen he was going to hold accountable. He looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "Fix the deck plates before you fix the people," he said. "The people are standing on the deck plates. Most of them are exactly as good as what is under their feet." Pruitt had been standing on Calder Bay's deck plates for 12 years. That did not excuse him. Nothing excuses easy hands on a stranger, and I have never for one moment pretended otherwise. He owned his fists, but the base owned the folklore, the awards, the closed-out near misses, the lieutenant who cried, and the chiefs who dined out on the story afterward. He was a symptom running a fever, and if I spent my anger on the fever, the disease would attend my change of command on Thursday, wearing its dress uniform. And it would outlast me the way it had outlasted everyone. That night, in the hotel, I took out the pocket notebook I have carried since department head school and wrote one line, and underlined it and looked at it for a long time. The fever, not the disease. Underneath it, I wrote 3 more things. First, that in 48 hours I would command that waterfront, and the incident was not an embarrassment to be managed, but a mandate. The truest single piece of information anyone had handed me about my new command. Worth more than the entire turnover binder. No inspection I could ever schedule would have shown me what 6 minutes as a nobody had shown me. Second, that whatever else happened, Lieutenant Commander Adele Marsh had done, on camera and on the record, the exact thing that Waterfront had trained its people not to do. She had seen something wrong and made it stop, immediately, at volume, without checking first whether stopping it was convenient. Whatever the new Calder Bay was going to be built out of, it was going to be built out of that. And third, I wrote a question because I was raised on piers, and I do not trust answers that arrive in the first 48 hours. The question was this: when the noise dies down and the star is not standing on the pier, What will this base do to the next stranger? Everything I did for the rest of that spring was in service of getting that question a different answer. The change of command went ahead that Thursday on the parade field, with the band and the gun salute and the flag snapping in a wind straight off the water. These ceremonies have a script, and the script is designed to be forgettable. Mine was not, and that was a choice. When my turn came at the podium, I set down my prepared remarks and told them about Tuesday morning. Not the version the base had been improving for 2 days, the plain one. I told them that 2 days earlier, a woman in an old windbreaker had walked Pier 4 at dawn, and I told them exactly what that waterfront had shown her. The watch that never looked up, the safety lines with hammocks slack in them, the rusted chafing plate, the expired fire station tag. I told them she was dragged 80 feet by her collar in front of 2 duty sections, and that not one person in uniform said a word, and that the only voice that morning that sounded like the United States Navy came out of a radio. I never said Pruitt's name. I never said my own either, in that part. I just said, when I got to the end of it, that the woman in the windbreaker was standing in front of them, now wearing a star, and I let the silence do its work, and you could hear the flags outside the whole time. Then I said the only sentence from that speech anyone remembers. This base treated a nobody exactly the way it had trained itself to treat a nobody. Starting today, we retrain. The orders came out that afternoon, my first afternoon in command. A 48-hour waterfront standard stand-down, piers cold except for essential evolutions. Every safety line on every pier re-rigged and inspected, every brow watch re-qualified, every fire station tagged current or tagged out. Shore patrol stood down entirely for retraining before anyone wearing that brassard touched another human being at Calder Bay. Use of force, identification procedure, escort procedure, all of it rebuilt from the publication upward, and every scenario in the new training started the same way, with a stranger on a pier and a sailor deciding what kind of navy the stranger was about to meet. I signed all of it in daylight, and then I did the thing that mattered more than any of it. I published a memo, base-wide, recusing myself from any disposition in the case of the Shore Patrol petty officer involved in Tuesday's incident, directing that it proceed under the station commanding officer with no participation, no comment, and no back-channel interest from the flag. I wanted every sailor at Calder Bay to be able to watch the system handle him, and I wanted the system to be visibly, boringly fair while it did. Not everyone thanked me for any of this. The pushback arrived within a week, and it arrived through channels which I respected, and it arrived in the person of Command Master Chief Arlo Bishop, 55 years old, 36 years in the Navy, a man built like a capstan who had been at Calder Bay so long that pieces of the waterfront were informally named after him. He asked to see me alone, which took a certain steel, and he stood in front of my desk and made his case without a single hedge. "Ma'am," he said, "this waterfront ran fine for 30 years before that morning. You are standing down piers that won awards. The chief's mess reads that as an insult to every anchor on this base, and I would be lying if I told you different." I let it sit a moment, because he had earned the pause, and then I gave him the only answer I had. "It ran loud, Master Chief," I said. "Fine is what we are about to build." And I told him about the mooring near-miss closed out in 9 days, and the fuel spill written like the hose had acted alone, and the wrists and shoulders and the one broken ankle. And I watched a man who genuinely loved that base do the arithmetic he had been too close to do. He did not surrender that day. Men like Bishop do not surrender, they re-anchor. But when he left my office, he said one thing that told me the ground had moved half an inch. "I will see the lines re-rigged right, ma'am," he said. "If it is going to be done to my peers, it will be done properly." The sideways pressure was less honest. A retired classmate called me that second week, warm as ever, just checking in, and somewhere in the 3rd minute mentioned that people who mattered were hearing that Calder Bay's new flag was burning goodwill in her first fortnight over one bad apple and a bruised collar. That the smart play, the career play, was to let the mast happen quietly, take the apology, and bank the incident as leverage. He meant it kindly. That was the worst part. I thanked him for the call, and after I hung up, I took out the pocket notebook and looked at the underlined page again, because I could feel the current pulling, and I wanted my own handwriting to tell me where the channel was. The fever, not the disease. A quiet mast and a banked apology would have treated my pride and left the disease alone. Petty Officer Pruitt's captain's mast was scheduled for early April by the book at the normal speed of the book. Captain Halloran would preside as he would for any first-class petty officer on his station. The charge sheet was drafted by a legal office that had been told exactly nothing by me, ever, about what I wanted. I found out the date the way everyone else on the base found it out. And on the last day of March, the stand-down complete, I walked the length of Pier 4 in uniform at 0530 hours and found the safety lines taut, the fire station tagged current, the brow watch on its feet, and a fresh order pinned to the pier headboard, my signature at the bottom of it, the paper still bright against 40 years of weathered cork. I stood there a while reading my own name in the dawn light. Paper, my father would have said. Pretty paper. The pier decides. The mast convened in the first week of April in the station headquarters, with exactly the amount of ceremony the book prescribes, and not 1 ounce more. I was not there. I have never watched so hard in my life as I did not watch that proceeding. What I know of it, I know from the record and from Halloran afterward. Boatswain's mate, first-class Deacon Pruitt, stood at attention in his service uniform and was read the facts of a March morning that the entire base could already recite. He was offered the chance to make a statement, and everyone in that room expected the standard recipe. 2 parts apology, 1 part context, a dash of stress and staffing. Instead, he said 11 words that Halloran repeated to me that evening with an odd look on his face, and that I have thought about more than anything else anyone said that whole spring. I did what the pier taught me, sir. That is not a defense. It is just true. Halloran took his shore patrol billet permanently, formal counseling in the record, full requalification in every watch station he held, from the publications up, before he touched a single duty on that waterfront again. It was, by the standards of the folklore, an anticlimax. No brig, no busted crow, no career execution at dawn. It was also, and this was the point that took some people months to see, exactly what the offense and the record supported. No more and no less. The same disposition a stranger's case would have earned. The system had worked in daylight at its ordinary speed, and the whole base had been allowed to watch it work. And what the base saw was that the outcome did not depend on the victim's collar device. That was worth more than any punishment. What happened to Pruitt after the mast interested me more than the mast itself, though I only allowed myself to follow it from a distance, in the aggregate, the way you track weather. The first thing that happened was that his world got quiet. A man who had been the waterfront's main character for a decade became, overnight, a first-class petty officer with no brassard, no pier, and no audience. The sea stories about him stopped being told with admiration and started being told with a wince, and then stopped being told at all. The young sailors who had copied his walk stopped copying it, not because anyone ordered them to, but because the walk had stopped meaning what it used to mean. I am told he ate alone for a while. Institutions do their cruelest work casually, and I will not pretend I lost sleep over his loneliness, but I noticed it, because what a man does inside that kind of quiet tells you who he actually is. Here is what Deacon Pruitt did inside the quiet. He started showing up early. Not to perform it, there was no one left to perform for. The requalification syllabus that everyone assumed would be his exit paperwork, he treated like a plebe treats his first summer. He sat in the front row of classes, taught by second-class petty officers, years his junior. He took the identification procedure card, the laminated one we issue to brand-new watchstanders, and he tied it to his belt the way recruits do. And a man with 12 years on that waterfront walked around wearing a recruit's card without apparent shame. A chief I trust told me she watched him stay after a session to rerun a scenario he had passed, because, he said, he had passed it ugly. Meanwhile, the waterfront itself was going through its own version of the same season. Resistance first, then the turn. The resistance was real. Re-rigged lines and requalified watches cost man-hours, and man-hours come out of somebody's evening, and for a few weeks, the new standard was spoken of on the piers the way you speak of bad weather. Then in late April, a front came through on a Friday night, 40 knots of wind with gusts above that, and a destroyer's mooring evolution that would once have been improvised at midnight went textbook instead. Doubled lines already rigged, safety observers already posted, because the new standard had put them there before anyone was tired or hurried. A young line handler lost her footing on the wet pier with a working line under strain, and the taut safety lines that had hammock slack in them in March held her out of the water like they were designed to, because they were. Lieutenant Commander Marsh forwarded me the incident report the next morning. No cover memo, just one line typed at the top. The new standard just paid for itself, ma'am. I read that report 3 times, and then I did the hardest thing my job asked of me that spring, which was nothing. I did not go down to the pier to be seen absorbing the win. I did not summon the line handler for a photograph, or write anything base-wide, or attach my name to a single piece of it. The report went into the record, the crew got the credit through their own chain, and the flag stayed off the pier. The worst thing I could have done was stand there watching. Justice you supervise personally is just revenge with paperwork, and a standard you have to personally enforce is not a standard yet. It is a performance. I had not torn up that waterfront, so it would perform for me. I had torn it up so it would hold for a stranger some morning when no one important was anywhere in sight. By May, the arithmetic had quietly reversed. Injuries on the piers, the wrists and shoulders and ankles that used to be explained one at a time, stopped needing explanations, because they largely stopped. The awards paper got less shiny. The waterfront underneath it got true. My father would have walked Calder Bay that spring, read the lines and the rust in the watches, and bought me a coffee. And on the far edge of all of it, small in my rear view but unmistakably there, a big man with a recruit's card tied to his belt kept showing up early, getting ready for a question nobody had asked him yet. The request chit reached my office in the middle of May, having traveled the long way, which was the point. Boatswain's mate, First Class Deacon Pruitt, respectfully requested 5 minutes with the surface group commander, subject, personal accountability, chain of command endorsements attached. Every level had signed it. His division officer, his department head, his command. Halloran had endorsed it last with a single handwritten line. Recommend approval. He has earned the asking. Lieutenant Odom brought it in with my morning traffic and set it on the desk with a certain neutrality of expression that aides develop the way other people develop calluses. She asked if I wanted it screened out, which was her job to ask. There were a dozen clean reasons to say yes. The recusal, for one. The optics, for another. No one on earth would have criticized me for declining to be in a room with him ever again. He asked the right way, I said. That buys him the 5 minutes. He arrived at the appointed hour in his service uniform, squared away to a degree that would have read as theater if I had not already heard about the recruit's card on his belt. He stood in the doorway of my office, uncovered, at attention, and I watched a man who had spent 12 years being the biggest thing on any pier make himself small in a doorframe. And I let him stand there a moment, not out of cruelty, but because some sentences deserve the silence before them. "Ma'am," he said, "thank you for the 5 minutes. I will not waste them." And he did not. There was no recipe in what he said. He did not mention staffing, or stress, or the fog, or the failures of anyone else on that waterfront, all of which were real and all of which were available to him. He apologized for the collar, specifically, for the slap at my hand, specifically, for 80 feet of concrete, specifically, and for doing it in front of 2 crews who were learning what the Navy was by watching him do it. He never once looked at the floor. And then he said the thing that told me what the quiet had built in him. "I dragged you maybe 80 feet, ma'am," he said. I had been dragging that waterfront for years. Nobody radioed anyone about that. "Somebody just did," I said. "You are going to answer it." I want to be clear about what happened in that office and what did not, because these moments get retold as movie scenes, and the truth is better than the movie. I did not forgive him, not in the theatrical sense, and he did not ask me to, which was the most promising thing about him. Trust between us was not rebuilt in 5 minutes with a handshake. What happened was smaller and made of harder material. I set terms. The station was standing up a new watchstanders course that summer. The permanent version of the retraining the stand-down had begun, the course every gate sentry and brow watch and shore patrol candidate at Calder Bay would pass through from now on. I told Pruitt he was going to help build the identification and escort module, the exact procedures he had violated, and that he was going to build them with the schoolhouse chiefs, publication by publication, and that his name was going on the syllabus where every student could see it. And there was one more condition. Every class he taught would begin with the story of a March morning on Pier 4, told by him, plainly, with no softening, the day he got it wrong and what it cost and what it should have cost. A man rebuilding himself will accept punishment gratefully, because punishment ends. What I handed him did not end. I handed him a mirror bolted to a classroom wall and the obligation to stand a new generation of Calder Bay sailors in front of it. Class after class, year after year. He took it the way he took the mast. Straight up, no flinch. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "That is fair." It was not entirely fair. It was useful, which mattered more, and I think he knew the difference and chose not to litigate it, and that, more than the apology, is when I started to believe in him. There was one other piece of unfinished business from that spring, and I saved it for a morning when the whole staff was assembled at quarters, because some things must be done in daylight for the same reason investigations must. A flag letter of commendation is a small thing against a career, but it says what the institution values, and the institution had been saying the wrong things at Calder Bay for a long time. I read Lieutenant Commander Adele Marsh's letter aloud myself. It did not praise her loyalty or her discretion or any of the qualities that beautiful binders are made of. It praised her judgment. 6 minutes of watching, one decision, 14 words on an open net, no permission sought because none was needed. The citation ended with a sentence I wrote myself and do not regret. This officer's transmission was, on the morning in question, the only correct voice on the waterfront, and the standard of this command is that hers will never again need to be the only one. Afterward, she tried to hand it back to modesty, the way the good ones always do. "Anyone on watch would have made that call, ma'am," she said. "No, Commander," I said. "Anyone on watch heard it. You made it." That evening I stayed late, and on the corner of my desk sat the draft syllabus for the new course, spiral-bound, coffee-ringed, with 2 authors' names typed on the cover. One belonged to a schoolhouse chief with 26 years of service. The other belonged to a boatswain's mate first class who had been, 3 months earlier, the most infamous man on the station. I looked at those 2 names side by side for a long time, and I thought about deck plates and about what my mentor said people are exactly as good as, and I went home that night quieter than I had gone home in months. June arrived, and with it the quarterly readiness review, and I sat at the head of a conference table, looking at numbers that would have made my predecessor glow. Waterfront injuries down by more than half. Watch qualification currency at 100% for the first time in the station's recorded memory. The mooring near-miss rate, which used to be a statistic we closed out in 9 days, now a statistic we barely generated. Captain Halloran briefed it all with the cautious pride of a man whose countdown clock had stopped ticking. And at one point, and I had to keep my face still when it happened, Command Master Chief Bishop leaned across the table and defended the new safety line standard to a visiting squadron chief who had called it excessive. "Done properly," Bishop said, "it is not excessive. It is what right looks like." He caught me listening. Neither of us smiled. Both of us knew. I congratulated the room, and I meant it, and all the way back to my office I distrusted every number I had just applauded. Paper had lied to the space before. Paper would lie again the day we started loving it. The binder my predecessor sent me in February had been full of exactly this kind of morning. Rooms full of good people, applauding true statistics that added up to a false story. The difference between March's waterfront and June's waterfront was real. I had walked it in uniform a dozen times and felt it. But a standard you can only measure when everyone knows the Admiral is measuring is not yet a standard. It is a reflex to being watched. And Calder Bay had already proven to me once that it knew how to perform for the watched morning and live differently in the unwatched one. Late that month, we hosted a foreign ship visit, a frigate from an Allied navy, and the waterfront handled it beautifully. Escorts crisp, identification procedures flawless, the visiting captain complimentary in the way that gets written up in message traffic. Everyone from the gate sentries to the tug crews had known that visit was coming for 6 weeks. It proved the Piers could pass a test they had studied for. It proved nothing about the only test that mattered, and I said so to no one except the pocket notebook. That week, I went looking for Crane's letter again, the 2019 one, the paper gone soft at the folds. I had reread it at every promotion and every funeral for 7 years, but that June evening I read it differently, because for the first time I was holding it as a flag officer with a waterfront of my own, which is to say, as the person the letter had been aimed at all along. Most of it was gossip and affection, an old man's handwriting wandering between war stories. And then the one line, waiting for me the way good sentences wait. You will know the Standard is real the day it works on a stranger. I sat with that letter a long time on the flag bridge wing while the sun went down over the anchorage, and Lieutenant Odom found me there, because good aides always know, and for a while we watched the harbor lights come on and said nothing at all. Then I told her what I was going to do because she was the one person who had known the first time. And there was a symmetry in that I was not willing to give up. The same windbreaker, I said, the same hour. Pier 4 at dawn, some morning in July, unannounced. Except this time there would be no courtesy note to harbor operations, no log entry, no safety net woven the night before by a thorough lieutenant. Nobody warned. Nobody watching the watchers. The base would get a stranger at dawn, the genuine article this time. And whatever happened on that pier would be the truth about everything I had spent 4 months building. The real inspection, the only one Calder Bay had never scheduled. Odom was quiet for a moment, and then she asked the exact right question, which is what I keep her for. And if it fails, ma'am? I gave her the only honest answer I had. Then I needed to know that more than I needed a good morning, I said. If the Standard was a performance, better to learn it in July from a petty officer's grip on my collar than to learn it in some winter mishap report with a sailor's name in it. The kind that gets closed out in 9 days. A commander who would rather protect her good mood than test her own standard is running a base on vanity. And I had seen where that road went. I had been dragged down 80 feet of it. She did not argue. She did make me promise to carry my ID in the inside pocket, same as before, and to actually produce it this time if asked properly, because, as she put it, the objective is to test the watch, ma'am, not to get tackled twice in one tour. I promised. We laughed a little in the dark, and it occurred to me that in 27 years of service, I could count on one hand the people who had ever told me, to my face, not to get tackled. Every one of them had made me better. The first week of July gave me my morning. A front had come through overnight and left fog on the water, thick and low and moving, the same fog as March, as if the harbor had kept the stage dressed all spring, waiting for the second act. The night before, I took the windbreaker off its hanger in the dark of my quarters, navy blue, frayed at the left cuff, older than the seaman apprentices, standing watch on my piers. And I laid it on the chair the way I had once laid it on a hotel bed, next to a garment bag full of dress blues. 4 months of orders, masts, syllabi, letters, and re-rigged lines, and all of it came down to the same question it had started with, hanging in the dark with an old jacket. Would the pier pass? I came through the pedestrian gate at 05:30 hours with a paper cup of gas station coffee, and the civilian guard at the perimeter checked my ID without recognizing the name, which suited us both. The fog took me in the way it had in March, and Pier 4 assembled itself out of the gray one piece at a time. The nested destroyers, the shore power cables, the gulls complaining somewhere up in the white. The pier looked the same as that first morning. It just was not lying anymore. I walked slowly and I read everything, the way 2 dead men taught me. The safety lines ran taut from stanchion to stanchion, every hitch squared, and where a section had been renewed, you could see the fresh, seizing wire done properly, not hopefully. The chafing plate that had rusted through to lace in March was gone, replaced, painted, already weathering in, like it had always been there. The fire station wore a tag dated the previous week. And on the first destroyer's quarterdeck, the bow watch was on his feet, moving, eyes outboard. And I watched him pick me up out of the fog at 40 yards and track me the whole way down the pier, exactly the way a watch is supposed to track the only moving thing on the waterfront at dawn. I had gone maybe 2/3 of the pier's length when a young sailor stepped out of the watch shack and into my path. And my heart did something complicated because he was big, and for half a second the fog gave me March again. Then he stopped at a respectful distance, hands easy at his sides, and gave me the whole procedure like it was music. "Ma'am, good morning. This is a restricted pier. May I see some identification, please? Seaman Juniper Tate, his name tape said. He could not have been long out of boot camp, and there was nothing in his voice but the work itself. No swagger, no apology either, just a young man doing a plain thing correctly at the hour when nobody important is supposed to be looking. I told him good morning. I told him I would reach into my inside pocket for my ID, and he said, "Thank you, ma'am. Take your time," and his hands never moved. And something in my chest unclenched that had been clenched, I think, since March. He read the card. I watched him actually read it, rank, name, face, the way the module teaches, and I watched the moment the rank landed on him, because he was young and his ears went faintly red. But the procedure held him the way a taut line holds. He did not stammer or brace to attention or start apologizing for the fog. He keyed his radio and called it in. Position, 1 visitor, identification verified. In the flat, clean cadence they drill in the schoolhouse now, and the net answered him in the same cadence, and he handed my card back with steady hands. "You're clear, ma'am," he said. "Have a good walk." He never learned, in that moment, what he had just passed. That was the best part. To Seaman Tate, it was not a test, and I was not an admiral. It was Tuesday, and I was a stranger, and strangers get the standard now. He stepped back into the fog and left me standing on my own pier, cleared through properly by a 22-year-old. And I do not have adequate words for what that felt like, so I will just tell you what I did. I stood there and drank my terrible coffee while my eyes stung, and I blamed the fog, and the fog was kind enough to take the blame. At the pierhead, where the concrete widens, a class was mustering in the gray. A dozen brand new watchstanders with laminated cards tied to their belts, and at the front of them stood a big man in a first-class petty officer's uniform with his own card still on his belt after all these months, worn soft at the corners now. Deacon Pruitt caught sight of me over their heads. For a moment we looked at each other through the fog, the whole length of that March morning lying on the concrete between us, 80 feet of it, and he did not call his class to attention, and he did not say my name, and he did not break my cover. He gave me something better. He turned back to his students and nodded down the pier toward the young sentry in the fog, and I heard his voice carry the way it used to carry when it frightened people. That, right there, is how it's done. The class never knew who the woman in the windbreaker was. I finished my coffee and walked off my waterfront, as anonymous as I had walked onto it. And the gulls came down through the burning fog, and that was the whole ceremony. It was enough. It was, I think, the only ceremony of my career where everything on the parade field was true. Later that morning, in uniform, I had coffee at the pierhead with Lieutenant Odom and Commander Marsh. No agenda, and we laughed about things that had nothing to do with any of it, and the laughter was not at anyone's expense, and I noticed that too. Crane's letter was in my pocket, where it lives. I did not need to take it out. The Pier had already read it aloud. It was never about the collar. I want to say that plainly here at the end, because the collar is what people remember, and the collar was the least of it. A jacket mends. Pride mends faster than people admit. What does not mend on its own, what has to be rebuilt, hitch by hitch like a safety line, is the promise underneath a uniform that the standard is the standard at dawn, in the fog, for a stranger, when there is no one important anywhere in sight and nothing to be gained by getting it right. That promise is the whole difference between a navy and a costume. I got dragged 80 feet down a pier by a man who had been handed a costume. I got stopped 4 months later, on the same pier, by a young man wearing the real thing, and of the 2 mornings, I promise you, the second one is the one I will be carrying when I go. So here is what I want to leave you with. From the end of Pier 4, with the fog burning off, if you have ever been dragged by hands or by words, by people who decided who you were without ever asking, hold your standard anyway. Hold it especially when nobody's watching, because that is the only hour in which it counts. The loud ones write the folklore, but the quiet ones write the culture. And some morning, on some pier you have not seen yet, everything you held to when it cost you will stand up out of the fog, ask politely for your identification, and hand you back more than it takes. The best revenge was never the radio call. It was the morning the radio call was no longer needed. If you stayed with me to the end of this one, thank you. This story was never really about one man's hands on my collar. It was about what a uniform is supposed to mean at dawn in the fog, when nobody important is watching. So I'd love to hear from you. Has anyone ever decided who you were before you even had a chance to reach for your ID? Did you ever get your own version of that radio call, the moment someone finally said out loud that you deserved better? And honestly, if you'd been in my shoes, would you have let the system handle him or handled it yourself? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story hit home, hit that like button and subscribe. Hold your standard, especially when nobody's watching.